Good afternoon. I'm Peter Tefano. I'm the dean of the school. And as a dean, almost all the time, the first words that you say is, I'm delighted that, I'm thrilled that, I'm honored that. And I am delighted that we're all here to start this new year with an intellectual celebration of ideas. I'm delighted that Andrew's friends have come from all around the world to talk about his work and celebrate the work. I'm delighted to celebrate Andrew's ideas and to thank him for all he's done. I have to admit I'm less than delighted about why we're having this in the first place, which is I would much rather have all this celebration and thanking without him retiring from the school. But we can only do what we can do. And so I'm delighted to be here tonight. Now, I first came to know Andrew, and he doesn't know this, 25 or so years ago. I was at Harvard Business School at the time, and my colleagues at Harvard Business School kept talking about this British scholar named Andrew Pettigrew. And even though I'm a heathen financial economist, even I learned about some of the things that Andrew was working on, and we'll talk about some of those ideas tonight. And when I decided about 5 years to come here to Oxford, some of the people who came to see me said, and you are blessed because Andrew's going to be at the school. And indeed I was, not only because he's a great thinker, but I've leaned upon Andrew over the last years in order to do some really tricky and important things at the school, but also as a mentor and someone who could give me advice. From really the first day that I arrived, Andrew was extraordinarily helpful to me, giving me gentle but clear advice about the ways that we could run the school even better. And then he took on two incredibly hard tasks. One was to help us to go through the REF process, which any of you who know anything about UK higher education know that that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And then to set up a faculty review and development process. But I don't really want to talk about his institutional achievements tonight. That's not appropriate. Andrew's a thinker and a scholar. He's a leader, but I think I'd like to frame him tonight as a builder, if that's okay. A builder of ideas, and we're going to talk about some of those ideas. A builder of research communities, and you're all here as part of the research community, or different research communities been part of, and a builder of institutions at Bath and in part in here. And so tonight is a celebration of each of those three things. First, in terms of a builder of ideas, tonight we'll have a feast of ideas before we have a feast upstairs, after we have cocktails. Secondly, in terms of a builder of intellectual communities, tonight we've assembled part, and only a small part, of the intellectual communities that you've been part of, Andrew, to come together and talk about your work and celebrate that work. And as an institution builder, tonight we're here in an institution, one of many that you have touched over the years and touched in such a fantastic way. And so we're here to do those three things that Andrew's done so well, and to celebrate what I would call the Pettigrew pedigree, which is, and I think Teppo will talk about this a little bit more. It's not just those of us inside the room who've come to know how fabulous Andrew is. His pedigree would include all the schools he's been at, Oxford for sure, and Bath, and Warwick, and Harvard, and more. All the awards that he's gotten, and I need my crib notes here. Awards from the Academy of Management, Academy of Social Sciences, Fellow of the British Academy, honorary degrees, and even Queen's Honors. So let's celebrate tonight Andrew, his work, and the Pettigrew pedigree, and thank him for all he's done. But mostly, enjoy a conversation about great scholarly ideas from a great scholar. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Teppo, who's going to be leading us this evening with Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter.
So my name's Teppo Felin. I'm in the same department as Andrew. When we were thinking about this celebration, first we thought a dinner would be great, but we didn't want to let Andrew get away with just a dinner and drinks. We felt like we needed to put him on the spot a little bit, and so that's what we're doing here. We're trying to capture some of the intellectual and other building activities that he's engaged in over 50 plus years. It's been my pleasure over the past few weeks to read a lot of that material, and it's voluminous. I mean, there's so much there, and it's been just a tremendous joy to do that. And so we'll have a conversation about many of the things that he's done both intellectually, but also in terms of building various academic and other institutions. And we're also planning on leaving about 15 minutes for questions or comments, or even just opening up for ways in which Andrew's work has influenced you. I wanted to put up just a couple of things. I asked him to send a picture. He was reluctant, but there it is. So that's the picture. This list is just a partial. So co-founder, first chairman of the British Academy of Management, distinguished scholar of the Academy of Management. This is interesting. I went to look at the distinguished scholar of Academy of Management. The last two were Max Bazerman at Harvard and Mike Tushman at Harvard. First one was Herbert Simon. I think there's about 30 of them or so. Andrew is the only one at a non-US institution anywhere in the world. And so that's a big one. OBE for services to higher education, as Peter mentions, fellow of the British Academy, which has very few fellows sort of from business schools, and obviously professor and dean, and the list is long. But yeah. I went to Google Scholar just to look. He has hundreds of articles. I think it says 16 books, is that right? Andrew, as you see, he doesn't like to talk about this stuff, but you have to sort of dig it up, and there's a lot of material. And so he's published many books and many articles and been cited many times. My understanding is Harry Simonian here?
Harry's here, yes.
Oh, okay. So I was thrilled to read this article. In fact, most of us, we circulated, when we got it from Andrew, we circulated amongst our department. And any scholar would wish that there was this kind of sort of 5-decade sort of summary of their work, and it was just a tremendous piece to read. I was revisiting again this morning, and in fact, sort of the basic architecture of that will sort of form part of our conversation around thinking about Andrew's early career, his mid-career in terms of the center, and then him as dean. And so it provided a nice structure for us, so we appreciated that article very much. It's an excellent piece. And so I like this piece, this picture better. I was looking for pictures. He sent me the other one, but I like this one. This is, I don't know, you giving a lecture somewhere in Norway, but it was a high-resolution image, so I pulled it. I thought, let's go with this. And so. But with that, I think I'll sit down and I want to sort of, in interview style, have this conversation with Andrew about his career, intellectual contributions, and then we'll go from there. But Andrew, maybe we'll just start with that beginning part of your career in terms of your training and early influences. Can you talk about that? And I guess what's curious about Andrew's career is it sits at a really interesting nexus because business schools didn't really exist when Andrew, here in the UK, when Andrew sort of became a scholar. And the field of strategy, I don't know if it's safe to say if it was non-existent, but pretty much non-existent. And so you're at the nexus of sort of a beginning of business schools here in the UK, and then also the field of strategy. But maybe just start with your early influences and training in sociology. Who were your early influences?
Well, fine. Before I say anything, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming this evening. I think that I'm absolutely delighted, and that some people have come as far as they have. I think it's wonderful, and I should make a special mention of Joanne Brunet, who's come from Montreal, and Armand Hatchuel from Paris, and Lucas Zahn from Bologna, and of course people from all over the United Kingdom. So many thanks for coming. I really hope that everybody enjoys this evening. It's a kind of reflective evening. But I hope people enjoy just seeing one another again, because a lot of people here have been scattered, and from various places, and it's lovely that we're all back together again for this purpose. But my beginnings, well, in a sense I started as a social scientist before I even had any training as a social scientist. I went to a strange school, which was, the headmaster was a fellow who later on went to be headmaster of Gordonston School. And he had been at Gordonston School earlier in his career. In fact, when he left the RAF, he was a Spitfire pilot in the Second World War. When he left the RAF, he was lost after that experience. What on earth am I going to do after that? And anyway, he settled down in the school for a little while. And this school was a very interesting place. And people describe it as muscular Christianity. It's a school that the royal family went to. Anyway, but one of the ethos of this school was to get engaged with things way beyond the intellectual side of life, and because so we always had to go on outward bound courses. And you never think of me now, but I used to be quite an athlete and a mountaineer. Anyway, because of this, I got an opportunity to join an exploration group which went to Uganda, even before I went to university, and they noticed I was going to be studying sociology. Oh, well, he must know something about anthropology. I think just assumed they were the same thing. Anyway, although nobody actually, I'm talking now about 1961, nobody knew what sociology was in those days. They probably still don't know now, but they certainly didn't in those days. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, I became a sidekick of a guy called Professor Merrick Poznański, who was director of the Uganda Museum, and he set me off actually doing a study of which involved working with a particular sect of a tribe who lived between 10 and 12,000 feet on Uganda. So actually that was my first taste of social science before I even became an undergraduate. And that kind of thing actually has a big impact on you in terms of the recognition of getting close to the phenomenon. And I couldn't have been any closer. And that was then, in a sense, reinforced by the kind of place I went to study sociology, which was in Liverpool. In those days, early 60s, these departments were just being set up in the UK. And there was a very strong department, the London School of Economics, and the other very strong department at that time was at Liverpool. And I was directed towards Liverpool for two reasons. One, because the guy just before me, in the year before me at school, had decided to go off and study sociology, because in those days, you imagine at schools, none of the teachers would know anything about social sciences, would have an idea about a subject called sociology. You just studied, in those days, what you studied at A-level, So anyway, this guy persuaded me that this might be interesting, and off I went. And Liverpool was very, very, I think I'm going to say quite a bit about Liverpool in those days, because I think the theoretically informed empiricism, which is now kind of, one would hope, very strong in the study of management, much of it was created at that time at Liverpool by a very strong group who most people now have never heard of. And I remember the senior professor at that time, who was actually a Lord Syme, extraordinary. They made a sociologist appear in the 1960s, standing up in front of the undergraduates and saying, right, he says, never mind all this theory stuff. If you want to do sociology, get out into the pubs of Liverpool and meet the people. That sort of thing would clear a room. You can imagine. So, I suppose I'm emphasising the importance of getting close to the phenomenon. And my first experience of that was in Uganda, although of course it was impeded somewhat by language challenges. But nevertheless, so I think my start was in sociology, and. Of course, in those days in business schools, there were very, very few people who had been trained in a business school. And so all the people who I eventually, after that training in sociology, I went to Manchester Business School, which I'll say a lot about in a moment. But the issue there was that there was nobody to recruit who had this experienced this phenomenon. Everything was starting from an open sheet of paper. The institution didn't know who it was, didn't have a sense of an identity, of a purpose. The place was full of people who'd come from disciplines like economics, sociology, psychology, mathematics, engineering, all of whom were trying to imagine what it would be like to work in a business school and how to go through an identity change themselves. And my identity change, of course, was from industrial sociology towards something else. I didn't know quite what it was going to be. So this sense of the indefiniteness of the terrain and of it having to be learnt and earned, was very, very evident. And as Teppo was saying, the first business schools, at least in the university context, were created in this country only in the mid-1960s. And as a result, in the end, of government pressure and pressure from industry, this wasn't a sort of a pressure which came from academia. Oh, we need business schools. In fact, quite the opposite. It was a pressure which came from, because the people in industry and commerce were concerned about the poor productivity, the poor performance of British institutions at that time. And the feeling was, if we train our managers better, or if we even train them at all, this would make a difference to managerial performance. It would make a difference to the competitive performance in the UK. And this was the hope. And the hope was that this would be a kind of partnership between business and academia, and I don't think that partnership has really happened. Business schools have been set up, they've formed their own identity, they've gone their own way. I'm not saying that business schools are not engaged with their environment, they are in many, many ways, but the dream of a partnership between academia and business, I think, probably hasn't been fulfilled over the long term. But can I just mention one or two people in the sorry, I'm making this a long response.
This is perfect.
This is
perfect. This is perfect.
I'm trying to, as you all know.
I have one other question, and then we're done. No.
as you all know, I'm a contextualist. So I'm all the time wanting to place things in their context, and rather than just to get. So can I dwell on this just a little bit? This was the guy probably most people here have never heard of, W.H. Scott. He was the leader of the industrial sociology group at Liverpool, and he got there in 1951. So we're talking about a research group, which is going to be, again, a very important part of, I hope, the conversation we eventually have, the power and significance of research groups in university contexts. And he had been, this is another theme I want to, this generation, the generation that taught me, had all been through the Second World War. All of them, with one exception. And while we might have been worrying in our mid-20s, whether we were going to get a PhD or not, this chap he was in the 14th Army. He fought the Japanese from north to south of Burma, and he left at a different place, different character. He was actually, he looks harmless enough there, but he was actually quite a hard man. And I think that was a consequence of the experience he had. So we're talking about a generation of people who were quite different from us, had quite different experience from us. And he's the first. And he led that group. He eventually ended up in Australia, as you can see, Monash University. But he was a critical figure and in 1951, there weren't very many people doing this anywhere. So W.H. Scott's important. This person's even more important as far as I'm concerned. Now, wouldn't you like to be supervised by Edith Mumford? Edith Mumford was my PhD supervisor and was the first woman appointed as a professor in a UK business school. And she was also an industrial sociologist, also trained at Liverpool, and was a fantastic person. I think her philosophy in life was, and maybe you can tell that in her reaction, was that she used to say to me, Andrew, everything is possible in life until proven otherwise. Now, when you have somebody, when you're at that age, believing in a philosophy of that, you're a very lucky person. And Edith Mumford was a great scholar. She was terrific at building research teams and building research projects. And of course, she was also, she was the daughter of the chief magistrate in Liverpool. She had one or two jobs in personnel before she took a job in the sociology department. And she did a lot of very important work in the docks and in the coal mines. And if I can give you one or two quotes from this work. She said that this is in relationship to her work with the dockers. Remember, this is research where researchers get close to the phenomenon. Enid says about life with the dockers, they were terribly nice to me whenever I turned up as an observer, because she was a participant observer. This was observing phenomenon. So they were terribly nice to me when I turned up, but they were awfully embarrassed at what I might catch them doing. And that was life with the dockers. Life with the miners, I would drench myself with perfume so that the ventilation system would give the miners a chance to prepare themselves for my arrival. So this was close to the action, empiricism. And I don't want to dwell on this, but I'm just saying this is the phenomenon. This is the style of work which I was taught. And you get close to the action, you get close to the people, you understand the context. And of course, it was also work which was very much concerned with, it was problem-driven work, but theoretically informed. So there was always this duality. We look at the big problems that they were concerned about were participation, conflict, and change. There was a lot of that, and they were studying this, of course, at the level of the factory, the workplace, the institution. So this is, I think, once you can't get over that sort of experience, and this is crucial in terms of my own development. Here's another person who some of you will know in the room, who's very similar sort of background. Tom Lupton was the son of a blacksmith who left school at 14, and he was an apprentice marine engineer. And he was called up, of course, as one was in those days in the Second World War, and he joined the Royal Engineers. And I went to hear actually Tom and something on an evening like this, and it was supposed to be his 80th birthday, but the people got confused. It was actually his 79th birthday, but everybody got over it. Didn't worry about it. But anyway, he managed to. His theme of his talk was Lucky Tom, and he started off by saying his second example of being Lucky Tom was getting out of Dunkirk. So Tom was at Dunkirk. You know. Bill Scott was in Burma. Tom was at Dunkirk. You know. Again, another. And he went on to he got a scholarship to Ruskin College, Oxford. He then got an entrance into Oriel College, Oxford, and got a PPE. And then he went off to the Liverpool Industrial Sociology, I've just mentioned, and then he got a PhD in social anthropology at Manchester, and wrote a book called On the Shop Floor. Again, it's the same phenomenon of engagement with close to the action research. The final person I'll mention, actually two final people. This person, who was my mentor through most of my career, and out of the blue, in 1968, this would never happen now, I got a telegram from Chris Argyris offering me a job. I never even, after I published my first scholarly article, and I'd never met the man before. And he had checked me out, so I discovered afterwards, but from my perspective, it was just a telegram which turned up one morning offering me a job at Yale. And this was my great opportunity to engage with a different academic culture at Yale University, which I had no experience with at all. And it was a fantastically brilliant scholarly department, and he was the brilliant leader of it, and a complex chap in many ways. You can see he looks mischievous. He's also he's the most challenging academic I've ever encountered. He was a great believer in confrontation and challenge, and you learned very quickly when you were dealing with Chris that again you had to be grounded. No, he's coming out with a smart theoretical observation, because he would immediately ask you, give me an example. And of course, you couldn't give him an example. It was the collapse of Stout Party, you know. So again, it was another form of grounded. Theory's okay, but let's ground it in something. And this was part of his philosophy, as well as being a very confronting man. And he died just recently, actually, but has been a huge influence in my life. But totally different background, of course, a psychologist. Now, the last person I'll mention in response to Teppo's question, which is something about roots, is this person here. And he is another very interesting guy. He was a Quaker philanthropist and businessman and academic leader. He was also in the Second World War, but he was a conscientious objector. And his life in the Second World War was spent with the Friends ambulance service. So he went all over North Africa, all over Europe, caring for the wounded and picking up people from battlefields. And this was his Second World War. And then he went to, he should have gone to Oxford earlier on, but he finally went to Oxford, I think, in 1946. And within 2 years, he went to Balliol College, actually, Peter. And he got a first in PP at Balliol College after 2 years of study, which isn't bad, you know. It's like what's called a likely lad. He returned to Balliol in 1962, and he, as a fellow of management. In fact, he was the first fellow of management in Oxford, and lots of stories about what happened at that time, about the people's, you could imagine, being the first in this field in a place like Oxford, in a college like Balliol. There was a lot of skepticism. And one of the things that he's written down about, so this is the skepticism, was that somebody said that management studies is as foreign and useful as drum majorettes. So this is what this is kind of skepticism that a fellow in management at Balliol College in 1962 would, of course he was ready for that, so you can imagine, no problem dealing with that. And he went on to become the first director of the Manchester Business School, and had a huge impact in the development of management education in this country. So he's another key figure in all this story, and that's a very long answer to Teppo's question. But I'm sorry, I just had to get that out. I think foundations are fateful in life, and I've seen that all over the place. Foundations are fateful in life, and you can't understand the contemporary world unless you examine the roots of the contemporary world. You can't understand personalities and people, the way they think, the way they act, the habits they've acquired, intellectual habits. We've all got intellectual habits in our business until you go back to find their roots. And I would say that the stronger the roots, the more significant the impact. And certainly I can see right throughout my career the impact of these people. Now, I guess many of you will not have heard of them. And I think that's the other thing why I wanted to mention them, because if this is a bit of historical reflection, I think it's important to look at the people who created the field that we are now participating in and appreciate the kind of contributions they've made. So, sorry about that. But I'll try. I hope that. But anybody want to react to any of that? Because some of you will know some of these people, and maybe would like to add something to what I've said.
Maybe keep reflecting. I want to make sure we get the mic to people if we.
Robin.
Just interesting that so far it hasn't come up in your discussion. Is you actually experienced both of the two Faculty Commission business schools?
I did, yes.
And it's sort of quite interesting that from your point of view, going by what you've said, to you, Manchester was much more influential than London was. Now, I mean, do you ever reflect on that or not?
Yeah, I think that's true. It's partly, of course, because this is about Liverpool and Manchester, and Liverpool and Manchester connected. That both Edith Mumford was in both places, and Tom Lupton was as well. So there was a strong connection between these two institutions, and I think, in a sense, Manchester became, insofar as it had a bias, it was a behavioural science, or what it became known as organisational behaviour later. But it was more of a behavioural science type place, and because of the influence of those two individuals and other people as well, frankly, who were there, that was one difference. London, of course, I was recruited at London by another very famous person who could equally be put up here, Derek Pugh, and I worked with Derek Pugh, and Ray was as well. Ray is, I know, apart from yourself, Robin, Ray is, I think, the only person in the room here, I think, who's also worked at London Business School. I saw London as different. Tim, of course, yeah. Later, Tim, that's right. I saw London as different. It was had a huge advantage, of course, that it was city in London, splendid accommodation, the Nash Terraces there, and of course close to the City of London. And it was interesting, of course, London Business School also, they had to find another Gregor McClellan to start the place off, but they couldn't find one, so they appointed the managing director of the Hoover Company in the UK, Dr. Arthur Earle, as the first director of London Business School. Before, essentially, the econometricians took over the place, and economics and finance has been the dominating influence, which is smart, because if you're sitting, that close to the City of London, and you didn't give that emphasis to the place, you'd be missing a serious trick in terms of engagement. So, yes, I didn't feel quite so congenial about London as I did, because I didn't think it had the same intellectual influence on me. And the group that Derek led was quite a fractionated group in many respects. And at Yale, where I'd been to between Manchester and London, it was the most cosy and friendly group I'd ever encountered in my life, actually. Still, actually. And that was largely because of Chris Ardress's style and behaviour, but also his beliefs. about the importance of people working together well. So I used to think at LBS, and Ray went to these seminars, so you probably remember them. I used to think that they didn't have a Hippocratic oath at LBS and the organizational building. It was a hypercritical oath, you know. And people used to get beaten up, you know, quite regularly in the nicest possible way, you know. It was a pretty tough environment, quite different in that sense emotionally from Yale. And so I think London was also, I thought, very much more conventional in terms of its educational philosophy. I mean, people immediately went into a box, an economics box, an OBE box, and you know, they immediately went into boxes and became a member of a tribe.
So Andrew, I want to make sure we pick up the storyline. I'm a little bit worried. The first answer was 25 minutes, and I've just calculated that we'll be here till 7:35 a.m. tomorrow morning to sort of finish up. But I want to pick up a few themes here, and we'll come back to these. So you've talked about sort of the observation of the participant, being close to the phenomenon, the people that influence you. One of the things that when we talked about this that was really important was the research culture at Yale, and you described that in very vivid terms in terms of the set of people that were there, how they reacted to, you know, publishing and things like that. Can you talk about that, and then we'll sort of catch the storyline and get to Warwick and your center and.
Yeah, I think the big difference the first big difference I noticed in the going to an elite institution like Yale and the group where I was part of, who were very, very strong scholars. I mean, Chris Ardress, Edward E. Lawler III, you know, Richard Hackman, Douglas T. Hall, Ben Schneider, all people who became very famous scholars in America. So they were an outstanding group, but the biggest thing and the first thing one noticed was, remember there were no computers in those days, or email, anything like that. Big thing is noticed was the enormous preoccupation with publishing. I'm not saying that wasn't important in the UK context, but it was a different kind of publishing. And I remember the big event in the day at Yale was at 10:30 the mail arrived. And everyone would be hovering around the mailbox, you know, waiting to see if their article had been accepted or rejected or how their revise and resubmit was going. It was very, very much dominated by publishing. In a way I hadn't seen, and it was publishing articles. Of course, in all these people I've mentioned all wrote books. You know, the finest form of scholarly endeavor in my day when I started was to produce a research monograph. That was not the case at Yale, although people did produce books at Yale, and Chris Ardress, many actually. But the preoccupation was publishing in that form, and that was a huge. And I mean, I won't mention the name, one of the junior professors there, just get a sense of the competition. He actually had a sort of a board outside his office in which he had listed all the articles he was working on, with a sort of flow chart, you know.
This was outside his office, not inside, right?
This is outside his office. You know, this is a revise and resubmit, you know, this is, you know, this one's been accepted, this one I'm still half working on, you know. Extraordinary, you know, I just couldn't believe it, you know, this kind of competitive performance, but at the same time, extraordinarily congenial. It actually was the most pleasurable place to work in terms of collegiality. People helped one another. I mean, I was appointed there because Chris controlled everything, of course. There were a bunch of psychologists there, including himself. He wanted a sociologist in the place because he wanted a different conversation to go on, and you know, he's prepared to take a risk to do that. So, of course, you know, since I had a totally different orientation from all the other people there, and immediately got into engaged conversations with them. But I learned enormously from that. So I don't know whether they benefited, but I learned hugely. And my work became more positivistic, as some people would say, as a result of that, which helped me later, actually.
So you were there for 2 years, had an opportunity to potentially stay at Yale, but ended up at London Business School. Yeah. I want to maybe transition to that second period because it's so important to your career and publications and so forth. So talk about going to Warwick and the center that you set up and how you built that community of. I mean, it's a very productive period where some of your key work in process was published. But talk about putting that center together because.
Yeah. Well, of course, I haven't mentioned any of the things I've published, but while all this was going on, I was publishing and doing research and publishing anyway, and the two important things I published was a book called The Politics of Organizational Decision Making, and The Awakening Giant, Continuity and Change in ICI. And that book was published in 1985 and attracted a huge amount of attention, mainly because, not because of the book, but because the book was saying some quite interesting things about the board of ICI. I think probably one of the things I've been fortunate at, or maybe quite good at, is you can't do the kind of research that I've done without being able to negotiate access. And, I would say actually I'm the only social scientist in Britain ever to interview members of the royal family. I was the first person to get into the boardroom of ICI and study an elite institution, which was the biggest manufacturing firm in the UK, the second biggest chemical company in the world. And I think there is a skill at that. And anyway, I got in and did the work over a 10-year period, eventually wrote that book. And as I say, it was published at a time when Sir John Harvey-Jones was the chairman of ICI, and the press loved him. He was a chief executive or chairman who would talk relatively openly. He never told the whole truth, of course, but he told a lot of it, and he didn't talk flannel to the journalists. And they knew that, and they appreciated that. And so there was a lot of publicity to go, because it was seen to be partly opening up what Harvey-Jones was doing or had done, and why he got to the top, and why he was able to change ICI at that time. So this was a great opportunity to build on that and to get some big research grants. So I applied for 2 big research grants to create the centre. One was to do with the competitiveness of British industry, and the other one was to do with the relationship between business change and human resource management change. And some of one of the senior people who led that project is here, Chris Hendry. And that was the first and when those 2 grants came in, I thought, well, I better organise this together into a centre. So in other words, I didn't start with the idea of creating a centre. I used the money which became available to recruit 4 very able people, very talented people. And then in the first year of the centre, another big grant came through, and I was able to recruit 2 more. And one of those is here, Lorna McKee's here. That was a big study of change in the NHS, which is a big issue. And so I think this was an opportunity taken to create team working. Big themes, big teams, is my philosophy of research. And if you look back at that and think, oh, what could I have achieved over that 10-year period on my own, compared with what was possible with a group of very able people. Now, my philosophy of recruiting people at that time, and I was only able to do this because I got a lot of money in these grants, my philosophy, frankly, was, it sounds a bit hard-faced, was to say, look, I'd prefer if people made their mistakes somewhere else. And I was to recruit people who had already had a real experience of the phenomenon. And that was a great insight, because it meant that the people who came were not only very talented, but were experienced, and and that they could get on with this work in a not totally autonomously. There had to be some element of leadership, but in the setting. But that was a huge advantage. And the centre went on from that to do all kinds of other important work on boards of directors and we're going to be doing a study of the the top 500 companies in this country, looking at the boards of directors and power and influence on the boardroom, which is an understudied phenomenon in the UK. And I could mention many other projects as well. And eventually, I'm looking at Evelyn who's facing me there, eventually a quite different kind of study, which looked at the innovative forms of organising in company performance. And this required the creation of a research team, of about seven or eight countries. It was the UK, it was Japan, it was the United States, it was Spain, France, Switzerland, Sweden, and to look at this phenomenon of new forms of organising, which was reputed to be going on in throughout the world. We were sceptical about it. You used to, in those days, at the London, the Heathrow Business School, as we would call it, you'd be picking books off the shelf there, which would be making all kinds of assertions about what was going on in the world with no evidence whatsoever. So that project actually was precipitated by a sense of questioning about what people were saying in business schools about this phenomenon. But
can I touch on that? So intellectually, I mean, you've touched on aspects of what you've worked on. But intellectually, how would you situate your work in terms of kind of sociology, behavioral theory of the firm? As I read your work, there's aspects, even sort of in the 70s, of things that later people like Giddens and others would talk about, sort of already there in essence. But how would you situate it related to sort of, sociology and then behavioral theory of the firm and the work that you've done in terms of your contribution in terms of process and so forth?
Well, I suppose I remember at this stage, all these fields are still being created.
Right.
They had still unclear identities, and I suppose if in terms of challenging the identities, I did that in a number of ways. I remember Chris Ardress, I tried to rewrite my PhD, and he read the first 2 chapters of the book, and he said to me, "Andrew, don't do this," and I was criticizing the Holy Grail at that time, which was the behavioral theory of the firm, Saïd and March and Simon.
And what specifically about it?
Well, I think that, to me, that although March was a political scientist,
right,
the book was, the material was underplayed very significantly, the role of power and influence as a contributor both to how decisions were made and how changes occurred and how strategy was made, actually. Right. So the political lens into the study of organizational phenomenon really arose out of that critique, and then a critique of the strategy literature, which was very wrapped up in dichotomies. First of all, one formulated and then one implemented. Or here's the content of strategy, here's the process of strategy. And I wanted to sort of treat these things as dualities. That how can you possibly talk about process if you don't also talk about content? How can you possibly understand how things are being implemented if you didn't reflect on how they're being formulated? To see these things as integral and to bring into those literatures the language of process, which means studying things over time. And looking at a historian over here, right in front of me, who actually we haven't talked very much about this Chris all the time we've been here, but it seems to me that social scientists haven't made time for time. Much of social science is an exercise in comparative statics, and I could see right from the outset that one wanted to examine how the becoming of things, not the being of things, the dynamic analysis of phenomena. And so I think the leitmotif for my career, I think, is catching reality in flight, as I've always described it as. I think that's probably the contribution I've made into those sort of fields, and with it, a great interest in. I'm an amateur historian, not a proper historian, and a great interest in the significance of history, not just because one has to be concerned with antecedents, but because of all the other things that go with historical investigation and with the historical perspective. The ability to explain phenomena, the transformation of phenomena over long periods of time. Right. And so these things are all crucial to what I've been trying to achieve.
Yeah. So what's intriguing about Andrew's career is that these issues of process and change and strategy. You were at Warwick, you had your center, you also became a dean, and there's aspects of what you'd studied in organizations that you essentially put into practice in going to become a dean of a business school there at Bath. Can you talk about which aspects you utilized? I mean, you actually have fantastic frameworks to think about change. When are organizations receptive for change? How do you build coalitions? And it's intriguing how those aspects showed up in your tenure as dean. And if you could talk about that, how you put that into practice.
I think, people first of all, when people discovered I was volunteering to be a dean at the age of 59, they said, "Andrew, what on earth are you doing that for? There must be something wrong with you. why you take this is a punishing job. Why would any sensible person, knowingly and willingly, take on a punishing job like this? And of course, I'd seen many deans in actions by then, and I knew what they were saying. It's not as if I was naive, And but frankly, I was getting bored, and I wanted to do something different. So I think that was the motivation. And I also knew one had to be very careful where you took on such a position. And I think, fortunately, I had a mentor who was already at Bath, Philip Powell, who's over here, and where's Philip? There's on the, who eventually became the deputy dean at Bath, and he filled me in on the necessaries, or most of the necessaries, of what was going on there. And I could see this was a top 10 university, with a management school which had a good reputation, which had become a little bit of a Sleepy Hollow. I think not willfully, but it had become a sleep. And I think it was probably my job to waken it up, and which I tried to do. And if you want to talk to me about how that was done, perhaps since there are people here from Bath, I don't know how to be careful what I say, but I think the first thing, of course, is you need the coalition of the willing in education institutions. And
so, what did that look like in terms of what you did there?
Well, I think it looked like, first of all, finding somebody you could trust completely. And you had a good relationship, who you respected as a confidant, and then as a deputy. I think the relationship, I'd studied enough leaders by then to know that leadership is a collective activity, and not an individual activity, of course. And I think that was crucial. I think finding the people in Bath who were unhappy with the way the place was becoming a little bit of a Sleepy Hollow, and wanted action, wanted change. And some of those people are in this room who they knew that Bath could be much better than it was, although it was a very good place. It could be better. And so they were looking for a stimulus to make the place better. And that meant, and of course it helped the fact when I arrived there, we went straight into a deficit. The people in the end of the era of the previous regime, they'd taken their eye off the ball. And this was, of course, a great help, because it meant I could then do things which were easier to do, because people were saying, well, we can't, how can you have a business school which isn't run isn't making money as a business? So that made it actually easier. And this is all about using the context to mobilize the context, to create the coalition, to start doing. But you've still got to make up your mind about what you're going to do, of course. And this is where, again, you need the advice of other people and the experience of other people. But I felt, and I think the other thing I learned about this, which is a truism in life, and was certainly part of Edith Mumford's philosophy, is that somehow or other you need to create a sense of positive energy. The most important thing in life, I think, in the academic world, which isn't always there, is a sense of positive energy. And I'm not just meaning that at the individual level, but a sense of collective positive energy. And it's an indefinable thing, but it's a crucial thing. And I try to create positive energy by the coalition of the willing, but also by making innovations. People, I think, more likely to commit if they can see that there are innovations which are purposeful and useful and effective for more than one reason. I remember the other, if I can mention George Bain this evening, who is, many of you will know, another Oxford man, of course, but was those who don't know him, Dean of the Warwick Business School, then Dean of London Business School, then Vice Chancellor of Queen's University, Belfast. One of George's favourite phrases in those days for taking on an institution in a way which would give you room for manoeuvre politically, but at the same time communicate a sense of values. His famous phrase was, "What we want is balanced excellence." It's a wonderfully ambiguous phrase. You know. But actually, it has its uses, you know, and I'm sure George used that many times, but it works. But of course, you've still got to define what excellence means and then translate that into operational innovations and changes. So I think, in other words, I think my experience, and this, of course, people challenged me on this. They said, after they'd told me innumerable occasions, why on earth are you doing this for? The next retort was, which is a bit dismaying, the next retort was, well, now you've got to practice what you preach. So I tried to practice what I preached.
Very good. Well, this has gone not how I expected, but I suspect that your career has had similar twists and turns. We've got a lot of wisdom and past experiences with Andrew here in this room, and so we want to make sure we leave it, let you have a chance to ask questions or even just make comments. We've got a few microphones here where we can enable that. But anybody want to jump in on any specific points? I've got additional questions I can ask, in fact, quite a few, but anybody?
Good.
Do you want to start over here? We'll start here and then we'll come over here. Yeah.
Hello, Andrew.
Hi there. It's scary. This is my brother-in-law.
I've got a long list of questions to ask you. My first question was actually, you were talking about Enid. I can't. It was a wonderful.
Edith Mumford.
Yeah, what a wonderful name, Enid. You don't get that very often nowadays. And you were talking about her kind of direct approach and going to visit things, and obviously the industry, your industry, if I can call it that, was in its infancy and growing, and it was all exciting and new. And then you talked about the disconnect between business schools and business now. I'm not a business school person, I should point that out. What do you think is the purpose of a modern day business school now?
I think it's the purpose that there's always been there. I think it's to understand, to explain, and to communicate important knowledge. But not just any kind of knowledge, but knowledge which has the potential to be useful. And and I think what happened, I think the same thing happened in the United States, and was, what happened in the United States in terms of evolution was the development of people called trade schools. People felt they were too close to industry. They were not academic enough, not scholarly enough. Then there was a reaction to that, and the post-Second World War philosophy of trying to make a management science, led to a much more academic development of academic culture and academic values, and a cadre of people who were essentially scholars of the phenomenon, but not necessarily engaged with the phenomenon. And then there's been a counter-reaction to that. So I think the pattern here, I think what I said about the importance of the people who initiated the drive for business schools in this country, remember, they were from business. Before government, and certainly long before academia, they were looking for a partnership between industry and of a more sustained and closer kind of engagement than I think that's happened. And I think there's now a counter-reaction to that. I mean, the latest concern with the government here, I may have mentioned this to Adrian, of course, is that our work should be much more, and work of all scholars in this country actually, should be much more engaged with society. And should be much more impactful upon society. So, in a sense, there's a national corrective to this, which I think will be a huge help, at least I hope it's going to be a huge help, in terms of creating this duality of scholarly quality, scholarly rigor, and at the same time engagement with practice, and a mutuality of interest between that. And I think it's perfectly possible for that to develop, but it's a constant challenge for business schools to do that, because they're being cross-pressured to be many different kinds of things, in a way that universities are. Universities are being asked to take on purpose after purpose after purpose after purpose, too many purposes, And I think one of the problems of business schools, I mean, at least there is to me a scholarly literature on universities where people are thinking quite deeply about the idea of a university, and discussing these things. I don't see the same literature on business schools. There is no intellectual literature of any strength, I think, on what is a business school, you know. And I think that's a problem to us in terms of dealing with this issue of engagement and of impact, and somehow or other being scholars and at the same time being purposeful, impactful contributors to society.
I think we have a few more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike, mine's partly a comment really, which is endorsing exactly what you're saying there, but just it really arises going back to the comparison you were making between London and Manchester. I happened to interview Tom Lupton and John Morris and others from there for my PhD, and there was a phrase that John Morris used, which he was describing the way he saw Manchester working, which is co-creation. And there's a sense, what I got from that was this idea of, that they were doing something new, and they had to think how their way of organising responded to the sorts of things they were wanting to do in connecting with the society and industry at large. And really my question and comment really is, and you really answered it, has that been lost? Do the business schools really address the fundamentals of how they actually operate in terms of what they want to achieve? And my view would be no, because so much caught up in the minutiae of adjusting syllabuses and curricula and addressing how they're performing in their REF, and this whole focus on publishing for publishing's sake. And what is the business school there for? I think people are so inward looking. You would seem to be.
Yeah, no, I think, Chris, you're absolutely right to emphasise that, and I think it became known as the Manchester method. This is the term they used to try and develop this. And this wasn't going on at London, at least not. I didn't see this. It was a very much more conventional place in terms of how it was organised intellectually and how it was organised educationally. Manchester was much the more innovative, but maybe they were too innovative, and there was a counter reaction to this in the 1980s. About this, the practice philosophy. It's more complicated, but if I can use that as a summary device to what you were saying, there was a counter reaction to it in the 80s, led by the university, who were saying, "Where's the scholarship in the Manchester Business School?" It was the university that started to beat them up, with their educational philosophy. They were seeing that it had its consequences, and they wanted to get them back into balance again, balanced excellence. So it's a constant problem, I think.
There's another question right here. Yeah.
Armand.
I was one of the fans of the Awakening Giant when it appeared, but I want to pick one expression you used. You said, "Big themes, big teams." And could we take it around and say that you cannot reach big themes if you don't have big teams? So this could make us, as organization theorists, think about what I would call the disappearing of labs. There is no science I know where breakthrough didn't came from a club or from a school of thought. Oxford here, philosophy of science, history of science, we can find what the invisible colleges. So don't you think that even the engagement purpose that you like to put forward needs a rethinking of what is a department? What is the basic structuring of a team in business schools?
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm thinking about a team in a very specific sense, as much as you were talking about a lab in France, I'm thinking about a research community within a bigger scholarly department. And I just could go from my own. I gave you the Liverpool experience of the huge impact that group had, and eventually it dissipated. This is what happens. Research centres have cycles. And you can see the same thing happening in the United States in our field. They have the cycles of growth and development and then of dissolution. But my big two experiences of this are the industrial sociology group and then my own attempt at Manchester. And there are many others of course, Derek Pugh's group, which wrapped up in the Aston Studies, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which of course is still going, probably not doing the kind of work that they were so renowned for in the 1960s and 70s, but nevertheless had a huge impact as a community. And I mean, of course, these communities do take a great responsibility to build. They do require somebody to put their head above the parapet and try to do it. And of course, they don't always work. They don't often survive for long enough to have an impact. So now I'm completely sold on the notion of big themes, big teams. But of course, it's not for everybody. Not everybody wants to work in a big team. Some people like to work on their own. They like to work with their doctoral students. And so it's not. I'm not suggesting this is a form of organising for innovation that's right for everybody. But my own experience of it is that it had a huge impact that I observed, and it's quite. The sort of issues that two colleagues here and I are working on a paper at the moment on big systems change, on studying big systems change actually. And the point of this paper is to say that. That we've been the big issue, although there are challenges at the institutional level, like the one we're just talking about, the biggest challenges today in change world are not at the institutional level, they're at the cross-system level. I mean, the problems you see in the European Union, dealing with the refugee crisis, even the financial issues in the European Union, the problems of dealing with environmental issues, and these are the big, huge challenges for today, and you're not going to study those things on your own. That's a truly big theme, but finding the money and the talented people, which obviously you need to do that well, is a big challenge for somebody or some set of people. So I'm merely reiterating. And I know that big themes, big teams has been an important part of your history in the Paris Tech now, or École de Mines, and I think it's. I can't emphasize how important it has been and how important I still see it being in our field.
So I think we have one more question up here. Is that right?
This is more of a comment than anything
Okay.
else.
Maybe use the microphone so we can capture it. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Just
Is it on? Right, fine, okay. Start with the dark side, which is the quality assurance agency and all that, and I think that is the dark side for universities and business schools and everything else, and I'd abolish the whole thing tomorrow, and hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later. But I want to come on to a lighter side. Andrew was talking about sociology, and I think when he was being educated, when I was being educated, T.G.F. Brandon, who was Professor of Sociology at Manchester University at the time, said sociology is a blasphemy, it comes close to heresy, and I don't think that question's actually ever been answered. I first met Andrew when I went as Senior Research Fellow to CCSC, and I've been working for the PA Consulting Group, and it was just a new world that opened up to me in academia, and I'm glad that I went there. And Robin, who's sitting here, Robin Wensley, I had lunch with him the first day I was there, and he said, I'm doing what I'm going to do in this research, and I said, I'm going to do a PhD part-time, and he said, who's your supervisor? And he said, Andrew Pettigrew. And he said, heaven help you. So, the other one was Chris here. But I had the most fantastic time ever I've had in my life. Thank you, Andrew.
I think that's a great note probably to end on. We didn't touch, I don't know how you capture in an hour and change 50-something years of scholarship and building of communities. And I would recommend this piece that was, written by Harry. It's a fantastic summary of his career, but also all of Andrew's books and all the things that you find in there. There's a lot of richness there. But I want to thank those of you who've come here to celebrate with Andrew. We've got a drinks reception up at the club room afterwards, and then our dinner as well. And we've got people, I think this was mentioned, who've flown in from Canada, from Montreal, from all, across Europe, and so it's tremendous to have all of you here together. And thanks most of all for Andrew for allowing us to do this interview and have this chat, and we'll continue the conversation. So thank you.